I keep telling myself it was probably nothing. That's the part that bothers me most, actually. Not what happened, but how easy it would be to explain it away if I wanted to. And some nights I want to so badly. My name's Dana Ferreira. I'm 34. I work as a labor and delivery nurse at a hospital in Albany, New York. And in October of 2024, my husband Kyle and I rented a cabin for a long weekend near Indian Lake, up in the Adirondacks, off a dirt road that splits away from Route 30 about 6 miles past the general store. If you've ever driven that stretch, you know what I mean. The cell signal drops to 1 bar and then nothing, and the trees just close in over the road like a tunnel. We'd been married 2 years. Kyle's an electrician, works long hours, and I'd just come off a stretch of night shifts that left me feeling like a ghost in my own house. We needed something quiet. I found the listing on a rental site. Secluded Adirondack retreat, sleeps 4, no neighbors for miles. And honestly, that was the selling point. No neighbors. I laugh about that now in a way that isn't really laughing. The cabin itself was nice. Log construction, a stone fireplace, a loft bedroom with a window that looked out over a ridge of pines. The listing had photos of a lake nearby, though when we got there the lake was really more of a large pond, half frozen already even though it was only October, with cattails poking up through skim ice near the shore. The owner, according to the listing, was a guy named Russ Delacroix, who lived down in Poughkeepsie and only came up a few times a year. He didn't manage the property himself, though. We got there on a Thursday around 4 in the afternoon, and it was already getting dark by 5:30, that early autumn dark that swallows the mountains fast. Kyle got a fire going while I unpacked groceries, and for the first evening everything was exactly what we wanted. We ate pasta at the little kitchen table, watched something on a laptop since there was no real TV signal, and went to bed around 11 with the fire still ticking in the next room. I want to be clear that the first night nothing happened. I only mention it because I've replayed it so many times looking for something I missed, and there's nothing there. It was just a normal, good night. Friday was the day. He showed up around 10 in the morning, unannounced, standing at the bottom of the porch steps in a canvas jacket with a chainsaw case in one hand. He said he was just checking the wood pile, that Russ liked him to keep it stocked for guests. He was maybe 50, heavy-set, with a gray beard that came to a point and small eyes that didn't blink as much as I felt like eyes should. He talked to Kyle mostly. When he did look at me, it lasted a beat too long, and then he'd catch himself and look away, like he was aware of the habit and trying to correct it in real time. He asked. "Married a couple years," Kyle said. "Huh," Wyatt said and looked at me again. It was such a small thing. If you told me at the time that this comment would still be rattling around in my head 2 years later, I would have laughed at you. But there was something about the way he said it, flat, assessing, like he was cataloging something rather than making conversation, that made the hair on my arm stand up for just a second before I shook it off. He stacked more wood by the shed, told us to holler if we needed anything, and left in a pickup truck that had a plastic deer skull zip-tied to the grill. We watched him go, and Kyle made a joke about local color, and we didn't think much more about it. Or I told myself I didn't. That afternoon, we hiked a trail that started behind the cabin and looped up along the ridge. It was maybe an hour-and-a-half round trip, cold enough that our breath fogged, the ground crunchy with the first hard frost of the season. About halfway up, Kyle stopped and pointed at a tree about 30 feet off the trail. There was a game camera strapped to it. Nothing unusual on its own. Plenty of hunters and property owners use them to track deer. But this one was angled not into the woods toward animal trails, but back down toward the cabin roof line, which you could just make out through a gap in the trees. "Probably just checking on the property," Kyle said. I agreed with him because what else was there to say, but something about a camera facing a house instead of the woods sat wrong in my stomach the rest of the hike. We got back a little after 4, and that's when I noticed the porch light was on. We hadn't left it on. I remembered specifically because I'd made a comment that morning about how the porch fixture had a dead bug graveyard in the glass, and I didn't want to turn it on and look at it. Kyle said maybe it was on a timer, or maybe the listing photos had it staged that way and there was a smart switch we didn't know about. I let it go. Dinner Friday night was quieter than the first. I don't know if Kyle felt it too, or if I was projecting, but the cabin felt different after dark that second night, the kind of different where you catch yourself listening between sentences. Around 9:40, we both heard it, a vehicle on the gravel road, slow, idling near where our driveway met the main track, then continuing on. Normal enough, except it happened again around 11, and then a third time close to midnight, except this time it didn't continue on. It stopped. I remember looking at the digital clock on the stove, 11:52 p.m., because I was specking out here at midnight for a good reason. Kyle went to the window and looked out through the gap in the curtain. He said he couldn't see headlights, just heard the engine idling somewhere down the driveway, out past where the porch light reached. We didn't have exterior lights beyond the porch. Everything past maybe 20 feet was just black. We stood in the kitchen without talking for probably 4 full minutes. The engine noise didn't change pitch, didn't move, just idled. Then all at once it cut off. Not driving away, off. Kyle wanted to go check. I told him not to, and for once he listened to me without arguing, which honestly scared me more than the noise did, like some animal part of him agreed this wasn't something to investigate. We turned off the kitchen light so we wouldn't be lit up in the window, and we sat on the couch with the fireplace glow as the only light, and we waited. At some point, I don't know exactly when, my phone was dead and Kyle's was in the bedroom, we heard footsteps on the gravel, slow, deliberate, the way you walk when you're not trying to be quiet, but you're also not in a hurry. They came up near the porch, stopped, and I swear I heard the creak of someone's weight on the second step. Then nothing. No knock, no voice. Just silence that felt worse than the footsteps had. We didn't move. I remember Kyle's hand finding mine on the couch cushion and both of us just staring at the front door, waiting for a shadow to cross under it. It never did. After maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like an hour, we heard the footsteps again, receding this time, back down toward the gravel, and then the engine started and the vehicle pulled away. Slow, the same way it had. Neither of us slept much that night. In the morning, Kyle went out to check the porch and driveway before I even had coffee going. He came back in holding his phone, showing me a photo he'd taken. There, in the dirt beside the porch steps, was a fresh set of tire tracks that hadn't been there the day before, pulled up close to the house at an angle that didn't match any normal parking spot. And near the second step, a boot print in a cord, the second we had for Wyatt, which struck me as strange for 10 in the morning on a Saturday in the mountains. Kyle explained what happened. The vehicle, the footsteps, the tracks. Yeah, Wyatt said. Probably just some local kids. They mess around out here sometimes. Think the empty places are fun to bug. He didn't ask if we were okay. He didn't ask what time it happened. He just said he'd swing by and hung up before Kyle could say anything else. He didn't swing by. Not Saturday. We debated leaving early. Kyle was ready to pack up right then. And honestly, some part of me wanted to. But I'd used PTO for this trip, and I think both of us were embarrassed at the idea of running from something we couldn't fully explain. Tire tracks and a boot print and an engine that idled too long. We told ourselves it probably was kids, some prank involving the empty cabin, and that Wyatt's game camera pointed at the house was just a lazy angle, nothing sinister. We decided to stay through Sunday like we'd planned, but we moved the couch cushions and a lamp in front of the bedroom door that night, which tells you how much we actually believed our own reasoning. Saturday during the day was fine. We drove into town, got lunch at a diner, bought bear spray at a hardware store, even though it wasn't really a bear problem we were worried about. The guy at the register, older, maybe 70, asked where we were staying, and when Kyle mentioned the road name, something crossed his face, just briefly. In a way that wasn't really a question, we asked him what he meant. He kind of waved it off, said something like, "Just a habit to have out here, that's all," and changed the subject to the weather. We didn't push. I've thought about that conversation more than almost anything else from that weekend, because I think he knew something, or thought he did, and decided it wasn't his place to say it to two strangers passing through. Saturday night, we kept every light on. We ate dinner with the curtains drawn, and around 10 we started hearing it again. Not a vehicle this time, but something slower. A kind of shuffling out past the tree line on the side of the cabin near the loft window. Kyle grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, and I watched his face change when he looked out. He wouldn't tell me at first what he saw. When I pushed him, he said there'd been a shape standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, and when the flashlight beam hit it, it had turned. Not run, turn, slow, like it wanted him to see it turn, and walked back into the dark. Neither of us saw a face. I want to be honest about that, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know people want a face, a detail, something concrete to hang the fear on. We didn't get that. Just a shape, backlit by nothing, that turned toward my husband's flashlight like it had been waiting to be found. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat up in the kitchen with every light in the cabin on, and around 3 a.m. we heard very clearly someone try the front doorknob. Once. A slow feat. We didn't sleep away. Kyle's soul. Flashlight up, there was nothing there. Just the porch, empty. Cold air pouring in. And out past the light, the woods doing that thing where they seem to breathe. We left before sun even fully pack. Threw what we could grab into the car, left half our food in the fridge, and drove out that gravel road doing probably twice the speed we should have, both of us watching the mirrors the entire way to the highway. I called the rental company 2 days later, once we were home and I'd had time to think straight. The woman on the phone was apologetic, said she'd flag it, and casually mentioned that we were actually the third guests in 4 months to report something similar. Vehicles at night, someone at the door, a shape near the property line. She said the 2 previous groups had also left early. She said this like it was a mildly annoying fact about the listing, not something that should have been disclosed to us before we booked. I looked up Wyatt Coombs a few weeks later, more out of a need to do something with the unease than any real plan. There wasn't much. A Facebook profile with the privacy settings locked down, a few old posts about deer season, nothing that told me anything. I don't know if he was the one who idled outside our cabin at midnight, or knocked on the door, or stood at the tree line turning slowly into a flashlight beam. I don't know if it was him at all. Kyle thinks it was. I go back and forth. What I keep coming back to is that game camera, 30 feet off the trail, pointed not at the woods where the deer walk, but square at the cabin roofline. Somebody wanted a record of who was staying there, and when. I never found out why, and the rental listing came down off the site sometime last year without explanation. I checked recently, and the address doesn't come up under any new listing either. As far as I can tell, nobody's renting that cabin anymore. I still work night shifts. I still drive home in the dark most mornings. And every so often, when I'm walking to my car in an empty parking garage, or when I hear gravel shift under tires somewhere behind me, I think about that idling engine and the way it just stopped, like whoever was in it had decided something. And I get back in my car a little faster than I used to. Story 2. What my uncle left behind. My Uncle Frank died in March of 2025, and it took me until that June to actually drive up to his cabin. I kept finding reasons to put it off. Work, my cat's vet appointment. The fact that I hadn't seen him in almost 6 years, and going through his things, felt like admitting something about that. His property was outside Priest River, Idaho, up a Forest Service road that peeled off the highway and climbed for almost 4 miles before it got anywhere near his place. My name's Nora Ashworth. I'm 29. I do freelance graphic design, which meant I could take as long as I needed up there without asking anyone's permission. That turned out to matter more than I expected. Frank was my mom's older brother, a Vietnam-era vet who'd basically gone off-grid sometime in the 90s and never really came back. He wasn't a hermit exactly. He drove into town for supplies, had a landline, sent me a card every birthday with a $20 bill folded inside, but he liked being alone, and the cabin reflected that. Small, 1 story, a wood stove instead of central heat, a hand-dug well. He died of a heart attack in his sleep, and a neighbor who checked on him periodically found him 3 days later. That neighbor's name was, and he was the first person I met when I pulled up the driveway that June afternoon, a duffel bag and a stack of empty moving boxes in my trunk. He was standing near the property line. I didn't even see him at first. He was just there when I got out of the car, like he'd been waiting exactly at the edge where Frank's land met his. A tall man, maybe 60, wearing a canvas hat that put most of his face in shadow even in full daylight. He said he was sorry for my loss, said Frank had been a good neighbor, quiet, kept to himself. He offered to help me carry boxes. I said I was fine. He said if I needed anything, day or night, I should just holler. His place was close enough to hear. I want to be fair to him. It makes everything feel like a warning sign, and I'd never met the man before, so maybe some of what unsettled me was just projection. But there was a way he said day or night that stuck with me, like it was less an offer and more a fact he wanted established early. The first 2 days were fine. Sorting through someone's life is slow, strange work. You find things that mean nothing and things that mean everything in the same drawer. I found a shoebox of photos, most of them decades old, and one that looked recent, taken maybe a year before he died, of Frank standing in front of the cabin with his hand raised in an awkward half wave, like whoever took the photo had surprised him. I didn't recognize the photographer's shadow stretching into the frame from the bottom edge, long and thin in afternoon light. I set it aside and didn't think much of it. That was a mistake, I think now. Not because the photo itself was dangerous, but because I stopped paying attention to what it might have meant. By the third night, I'd fallen into a routine, work through boxes during the day, eat something simple, read by the wood stove until I got tired, sleep in Frank's old bedroom because it was the only bed in the place. Around 11 that night, I heard something outside that I told myself was a raccoon getting into the trash cans, a scraping, dragging sound moving along the side of the house. I checked a window. Nothing. I told myself raccoons don't leave much to see anyway, and went back to bed, though I didn't fall asleep for a long time after. The next morning, sorting through Frank's desk, I found a small notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore. Most of the pages were mundane. Grocery lists, a couple of phone numbers, notes about splitting wood. But on one page, dated about 8 months before he died, there was a short entry that read, "G at the fence line again after dark. Told him to knock if he needs something. He didn't say anything back." Another entry, 3 weeks later, heard someone at the back door around 2. Didn't open it. There were maybe 6 entries like that scattered through the notebook, spread out over the better part of a year, all some version of the same thing. A presence near the house after dark, sometimes identified as G, sometimes just someone, never with any resolution. Frank wasn't a nervous man from everything I knew about him.
He'd survived 2 combat tours. If he was writing this down, it meant something.
I sat with that notebook a long time. Then I did what I probably shouldn't have done, which is I decided the simplest answer was that Frank, alone up there for 30 years, had started imagining things in his final year, the way isolation sometimes does to people, and that G almost certainly meant Gideon, and that a lonely old widower checking on his lonelier old neighbor wasn't sinister, just awkward. I told myself this very firmly. I did not fully believe it, but I told myself anyway, because the alternative was harder to hold. That my 4th up there, I heard the dragging sound again, later, closer to midnight. This time, I didn't just check the window. I got my phone, turned on the flashlight, and went to the back door, because some stubborn part of me wanted to prove to myself there was nothing there. There was a shape at the edge of the tree line, maybe 40 feet out, standing exactly still. I want to describe it accurately. It was tall, roughly the height and build I'd have guessed for Gideon, but I couldn't make out a face, couldn't even really make out where the hat brim would be if he'd been wearing his canvas hat, because the whole upper part of the shape stayed in shadow no matter which way I angled the light. It didn't move while I watched it. I didn't move either. We just stood there, me in the doorway, it at the tree line, for what felt like a full minute before it turned. Unhurried, like it had made a decision rather than been startled, and walked back into the dark. I didn't hear footsteps. I want to be honest about that too, because it's the detail that bothers me most. No twigs, just a shape that turned and then wasn't there anymore. I locked every door and window in that cabin and sat up until it got light out. The next morning I drove down to Gideon's place. I told myself I was going to ask him directly, adult to adult, whether he'd been near Frank's cabin at night. His property was smaller than Frank's, a single wide with a covered porch, and when I pulled up he was already outside, like he'd heard the car from a quarter mile off, sitting in a lawn chair with a mug of something steaming despite the June heat. I asked him, as evenly as I could, if he'd been coming around the cabin at night. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. "Your uncle and I had an understanding," he said. "I checked on him, made sure he was all right." Something shifted in his face, brief, like I'd said something he hadn't expected me to know. "Frank kept odd hours," he said. It wasn't really an answer, but I didn't push further because standing there in his yard, no one else around for what felt like miles, I became abruptly aware of how alone I was, and how little anyone in the world knew exactly where I was that morning. I said something non-committal, thanked him for checking on Frank over the years, and left. In the rearview mirror, he hadn't moved from the chair. He was just watching the car go. I should have left the cabin that day. I didn't, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I still had 2/3 of Frank's belongings to go through and nowhere else in the world I needed to be. I did, however, call a locksmith in town and had him come out that afternoon to add a deadbolt to the back door, the one nearest where I'd seen the shape. The locksmith, an older guy named Pete, mentioned while he worked that Frank had actually called him for the exact same job about a year earlier, but had canceled the appointment the day before it was scheduled. I asked if Frank said why. I didn't sleep in the bedroom that night. I moved a sleeping bag into the small front room in view of both doors and left every light on. Around 1 am I heard unmistakably a hand pressed flat against the back door from the outside. Not a knock, just pressure, like someone leaning their weight against it slowly and then releasing. The new deadbolt held. I sat frozen on the floor for I don't know how long, phone in hand, no signal, watching that door. Around 1:40, the pressure came again, this time at the front door, closer to me than I'd been braced for. I didn't see anything through the window this time. No shape at the tree line, nothing to look at, just the door itself flexing very slightly against its frame like something heavy was testing it. Then it stopped, and I heard very faintly footsteps moving away across the gravel, unhurried, toward the direction of Gideon's property. I left before sunrise, same as the family in that other story people tell about the Adirondacks, though I didn't know about that one at the time. I only heard about it later, From a woman in an online forum for people dealing with problem neighbors near rural properties, when I finally worked up the nerve to type out what happened to me and see if anyone else had a name for it. Nobody did. A few people had stories that rhymed with mine in an unsettling way. Isolated properties, a neighbor who seemed to consider nighttime visits an entitlement, a slow pressure against a door that never quite became a break-in. Nobody had an ending either. That seemed to be the pattern. I sold Frank's cabin about 4 months later at a loss to a company that buys rural properties sight unseen. I didn't go back up to finish sorting his things. I paid a local company to pack and ship the boxes I still wanted, and told them specifically I didn't need anything from the back bedroom closet, though I never told them why, because I'm not sure I could have explained it in a way that sounded like anything other than what it was. I didn't want anyone opening that closet without me there, and I didn't want to be there when they did. I never got a straight answer out of Gideon Holt, and eventually I stopped trying. I looked up his name online a few times over the following year, out of a compulsion I couldn't quite shake, and never found much. No criminal record, no social media, nothing beyond a voter registration and a name on an old property tax filing. As far as public record is concerned, he's just a quiet man who lives alone near Priest River, Idaho, and checks on his neighbors. I still have Frank's notebook. I never told my mother about the entries in it, and I never will. Some nights, usually when I'm home alone and the heat kicks on, and the ducks make that first metallic groan they make before the house warms up, I think about a hand pressed flat against a door in the dark, patient, unhurried, testing to see if this would be the night it gave. Story 3. Camera Trap. I spent the summer of 2023 alone in a Forest Service cabin in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, about 11 miles up a logging road off Highway 12 near Lowell, Idaho, and I still can't look at trail camera footage without my hands going cold. My name's Simone Okafor. At the time I was 27, finishing my master's in wildlife biology, and my thesis work involved monitoring a wolverine population using a grid of about 40 motion-triggered cameras spread across roughly 60 square miles of backcountry. The arrangement was that I'd live at a research cabin the university had an agreement to use, hike out to service different camera clusters every few days, and radio in a check-in twice a week to my advisor, Dr. Holbrook, since cell service didn't exist out there in any meaningful way. I want to be clear that I loved that work. I'd wanted to do field work like this since undergrad, and the isolation didn't scare me going in. If anything, it was the appeal. The cabin was small, a single room with a wood stove, a cot, a desk for logging data, powered by a small solar setup that ran the radio and charged batteries for the cameras. The nearest other human structure, a Forest Service ranger outpost, was about 4 miles down the ridge, staffed part-time by a contractor named Denny Voss, who was technically supposed to check on solo researchers periodically as a safety measure. The first month was uneventful in the way field work usually is. Long, physical, a little boring, occasionally thrilling when a camera caught something good. I got a black bear sow with 2 cubs on one card, a bobcat on another, and once, unmistakably, the low, dark shape of a wolverine moving along a ridge at dusk, which is the kind of footage that makes the whole project feel worth it. Denny came by about once every 10 days or so, always unannounced, on an ATV that I could hear from a long way off, which I appreciated since it gave me time to compose myself if I'd been out in the field and come back sweaty and gross. He was maybe mid-40s, quiet in a way that read as shy at first. Short answers, wouldn't quite hold eye contact, always seemed a little relieved when the conversation was over. He'd ask if I needed supplies, look over my setup, and leave. Normal enough. Ranger District contractors doing welfare checks aren't exactly known for being social butterflies. The first thing that felt off happened in early July, about 5 weeks in. I was reviewing a batch of camera cards at my desk one evening, going frame by frame the way you have to, since most triggers are just wind-blown branches or a passing chipmunk. On one card, from a camera positioned along a game trail about half a mile from my cabin, closer to the cabin than most of my grid, actually, since I'd placed a few near the perimeter to track any wolverine activity near human structures. There was a frame time-stamped 2:47 a.m. showing a human figure standing at the edge of the trail, facing the camera. It wasn't Denny. I want to be specific about how I know that. Denny was stocky, maybe 5'9", and always wore the same faded green Forest Service ball cap. The figure in the frame was taller, thin, wearing dark clothing with no visible cap, standing with an unnatural kind of stillness, arms at its sides, facing directly into the lens like it knew exactly where the camera was. The infrared flash had washed out the face into a pale blur, the way it does with any subject that close, but the posture stuck with me. Nobody accidentally wanders into frame and just stands there facing the lens at 2:45 in the morning. I told myself it was probably a hiker who'd gotten turned around, or possibly even Denny in different clothes doing a night check he hadn't mentioned. I didn't sleep well that night regardless. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more cameras, all of them clustered nearer to my cabin than the rest of the grid, caught the same figure, or what I assumed was the same figure, always at night, always standing still, always facing the lens. Once at 1:12 a.m., once at 3:33 a.m., once closest to my cabin of all the sightings at 4:58 a.m., less than a quarter mile from where I slept. Cinchio checked in with Dr. Holbrook, and she suggested, reasonably, that it might be a poacher scouting the area, since Wolverine pelts do have black market value, and my grid's existence wasn't exactly secret. The university had posted about the project publicly. She told me to document it and mention it to Denny, and if I felt unsafe, to hike out. I didn't feel unsafe yet, or at least I told myself I didn't. I mentioned it to Denny on his next visit. He looked at the printed frame I showed him for a long moment. Longer than felt natural. Then he said, probably just someone from town messing around. He said he'd keep an eye out. He didn't ask which cameras had caught it, didn't ask about the timestamps, didn't really engage with the specifics at all, which struck me even then as strange for someone whose literal job was safety oversight in this exact area. Late July, the pattern changed. I stopped only seeing the figure on camera and started, twice, hearing something outside the cabin itself at night. Not an animal sound, which I'd gotten good at identifying after 2 months out there, but slower, more deliberate. Footsteps on the packed dirt path that circled the cabin, pausing near the single window, moving on. The first time, I told myself it was a deer. The second time, 3 nights later, I heard it stop directly outside the window for what my phone's clock, no signal, but still keeping time, told me was almost 6 full minutes, silence except for my own breathing, before it moved on. I started sleeping with a hatchet from the woodpile next to the cot after that. I'm not proud of how little that would have actually helped me, but it made me feel like I was doing something. The last week of July, I hiked out to service the camera closest to the cabin, the one that had caught the 4:58 a.m. frame, and found it had been moved, not knocked down, not damaged, repositioned, deliberately, so that instead of facing the game trail, it had been angled almost directly at the path to my cabin door. Someone had climbed the tree, unstrapped it, and reset it with intent. I stood there a long time just looking at the new angle, my stomach doing something slow and cold, before I unstrapped it myself, turned it back, and hiked straight to the ranger outpost instead of back to my own cabin. Denny wasn't there. The outpost was locked, dark, no ATV parked outside. I sat on the steps for almost an hour before I gave up and hiked back, arriving right around dusk, which is not a decision I'd recommend to anyone in bear country, but I was more afraid of the dark catching me on the trail than I was of anything with claws at that point. That night was the worst of the summer. Around at 11 p.m., I heard the footsteps again, slower this time, more deliberate, circling the cabin twice before stopping at the door. I sat on the cot with the hatchet across my knees and my radio in my other hand, though I knew transmitting at that hour with no scheduled check-in would probably go unheard until morning. I called anyway, quietly, giving my coordinates and saying I believed someone was outside the cabin. Nobody answered. The radio just hissed. The door didn't have a lock, only a simple hook latch, which I'd never thought twice about before that week. I watched it in the low light from my headlamp, and at some point, I genuinely don't know how long I'd been staring. Adrenaline does strange things to time. The latch lifted, not violently. Slowly, like careful fingers had found it from the outside and were testing whether it would give. It held. The hook caught. I don't know if it was ever going to fail, or if whoever was testing it simply decided not to push further, but after another long minute, the pressure released, and I heard the footsteps move away from the door, unhurried, and fade into the trees. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed only what I could carry quickly and hiked the 11 miles out to the trailhead on the logging road, moving faster than I probably should have on uneven terrain, and got a ride from a passing truck to somewhere with cell signal where I called Dr. Holbrook and told her I was done for the summer. The official explanation, once the Forest Service got involved after I reported it, was unsatisfying in the way these things often are. There'd apparently been complaints in prior years about a man, never formally identified, never charged with anything, who was known to locals as someone who didn't like people in his woods, a phrase one ranger used to me over the phone that I still think about. No name attached to it that anyone would give me, no follow-up that I ever heard about. Denny, when I asked him directly on a later call, said he'd heard rumors like that for years and left it there. I finished my degree using 2 summers of camera data instead of 3, and I've never gone back to that grid, though the university maintained it for a while after I left, with a different male grad student doing the fieldwork the following year. I asked him once at a conference if he'd ever caught anything strange on the cameras near the old cabin site. He said no, actually nothing at all. The figure never showed up again after I left. I think about that more than almost anything else from that summer. Not that it happened to me, that it apparently stopped happening once I wasn't the one living there. I still have the printed frame from that first sighting, the 247 M1, in a folder I've moved between 3 apartments since. I don't know why I keep it instead of throwing it out. I tell people when it comes up that it's a reminder of how strange fieldwork can get. That's not really the truth. The truth is I keep looking at that pale, washed-out blur where a face should be, trying to find something in it that would let me stop wondering whether it was watching me specifically, or just waiting for whoever happened to be alone in that cabin, and I never wanted to find out which. The 4th truck 4 of us drove up to a cabin outside Valle Cruces, North Carolina, over winter break in December of 2025, and it's taken me most of a year to be able to write this out in order, instead of in the jumbled way it usually comes back to me. My name's Derek Amundsen. There were 4 of us going, me, Priya, and our friends Marcus Villanueva and Ashley Kowalski, all of us finishing finals and wanting a few days to decompress before everyone scattered home for the holidays. The cabin was genuinely beautiful. Vaulted ceilings, a wraparound deck with a view down into a valley that filled with fog most mornings, a hot tub on the back deck that steamed against the cold. We got there on a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, unloaded groceries and a stupid amount of firewood we didn't end up needing since the place had a propane furnace, and spent the first evening exactly the way you'd expect 4 college seniors to spend it. Drinking, playing cards, watching a movie none of us really paid attention to. The first thing any of us noticed was small enough that we joked about it instead of worrying. Around 10 that first night, headlights swept across the living room window from the driveway, then kept going up the gravel road that continued past the cabin toward, as far as we knew, nothing. The listing had described the cabin as being at the end of the road. Marcus made a comment about how weird it was for a dead-end road to have traffic at 10 at night, and Priya said maybe it wasn't actually a dead end. Maybe there was another cabin further up we didn't know about. And that seemed reasonable enough that we let it go. It happened again around midnight. Same thing, headlights sweeping the window, engine noise passing by outside, fading up the road. And then a third time, closer to 1 in the morning, except this time the vehicle didn't just pass. It slowed down enough that the engine noise lingered outside for a good 10-15 seconds before continuing on. Ashley, who'd been the only one still awake with me at that point, muttered something about it being creepy and got up to check the window. She said she caught a glimpse of taillights, red, disappearing up the road, but no plate, no make she could identify in the dark. We didn't talk about it much the next morning. Daylight has a way of making nighttime stuff feel smaller than it was, but I remember Priya bringing it up over coffee, half joking, saying if a 4th truck showed up that night, she was locking every door in the house. We laughed about it. I want that on record, that we laughed about it, because I think about that laugh a lot now. Monday was a good day. We hiked a trail nearby, drove into Boone for dinner, came back and used the hot tub despite the cold, snow starting to fall lightly around us in a way that felt like something out of a postcard. We went to bed around midnight, all 4 of us a little drunk and a little sunburned from the cold wind, feeling good about the trip. Around 1:40 a.m., the same headlights swept the window. This time the vehicle stopped entirely, engine idling somewhere near the mouth of our driveway, not visible from any window we could get to without going outside. Marcus and I were the only 2 still up, playing a card game at the kitchen table, and we both went still at the same time. "That's the 4th truck," Marcus said, and even though he was trying to sound like he was joking, his voice didn't quite manage it. We turned off the kitchen light. We didn't wake the girls yet. In hindsight, I think we both wanted to believe it would just pass, the same as the others, and we didn't want to be the ones who panicked everyone over nothing.
It didn't pass.
The idling continued for almost 5 minutes before we heard the crunch of gravel. Footsteps, more than one set, we both agreed on that afterward, moving from the driveway toward the side of the house. That's when we woke the girls. What followed was maybe 20 minutes that I still have trouble putting into a clear sequence, because fear does something to memory that makes it come back in pieces instead of order. What I know for certain, we heard someone try the back door near the kitchen, the handle turning against the deadbolt. We heard, a minute or two later, a different sound from the opposite side of the house, near Ashley and Priya's room, that Priya swore afterward was someone trying to slide the window open from outside, though it was locked and didn't budge. At some point, Marcus called 911 and got a dispatcher who told him the nearest sheriff's unit was almost 25 minutes out given the road conditions and the distance. We gathered in the living room, the four of us, lights off, phones on flashlight but pointed down so they wouldn't show under the doors. I remember Ashley crying without making noise, which is somehow scarier than actual sobbing. I remember Priya holding a kitchen knife she must have grabbed at some point, hand shaking badly enough that I honestly worried more about her cutting herself than using it on anyone. The footsteps circled the house at least twice, by our count, trying at least 3 different points of entry that we could identify by sound alone. The back door, the window, and finally, closest and worst, the front door, where someone tried the handle, found it locked, and then, very deliberately, knocked. Slow, spaced-out knocks, like they knew we were awake and inside, and wanted us to know that they knew. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. I don't think any of us breathed for that stretch. After the knocking, there was a long silence, long enough that Marcus started to say maybe they'd left, and then we heard glass break. Not at the door. Around the side, near the kitchen, the small window above the sink. We all heard it clearly, a single hard impact, glass scattering onto tile. What happened next is the part I have the hardest time putting in order. Marcus grabbed the fireplace poker. I grabbed the only other thing close at hand, which was a heavy cast-iron skillet still on the stove from dinner. We moved toward the kitchen together, while Priya pulled Ashley toward the front door. The plan, if you could call it a plan, being to get the girls out to the car, while Marcus and I bought time. When we got to the kitchen, there was no one inside. The window above the sink was broken, glass on the counter and floor, cold air pouring through, but whoever had done it hadn't climbed in. Not yet, not that we could see. We stood there for a few seconds that felt much longer, poker and skillet raised, staring at an empty broken window with night on the other side of it. Then Priya screamed from the front of the house. By the time Marcus and I got there, she and Ashley were both standing frozen just inside the front door, staring out through the sidelight window next to it. Priya told us later, and told the deputies afterward, that she'd looked out and seen someone standing at the edge of the porch light's reach, not moving, facing the house directly. She used the word waiting. And that when she screamed, the figure had turned and walked, unhurried, back toward the driveway. And moments later, they heard an engine start and a vehicle pull away down the gravel road, the same direction all the previous ones had gone. Neither Marcus nor I saw the figure ourselves. By the time we reached the front hallway, it was already gone from view. We called 911 again to update them, and this time we didn't wait inside. We got everyone into Priya's car, doors locked, engine running, and sat in the driveway with the headlights aimed at the house until a sheriff's deputy finally arrived, almost 20 minutes later. The deputy who responded, an older guy who introduced himself as Deputy Pruitt, walked the property with a flashlight and confirmed the broken kitchen window, several sets of boot prints in the light snow near the back door and the side of the house, and tire tracks in the gravel near where the trucks had idled, though nothing conclusive enough to identify a vehicle. He told us, in a tone I want to describe as carefully neutral, that rental cabins on dead-end roads like this one occasionally attracted opportunists who'd watch a property for a night or two before making a move, banking on renters being unfamiliar with the area and slow to call for help. He said
it like it was a known enough pattern that it didn't need much further explanation, which somehow made it worse.
We didn't stay the rest of the trip. We packed in under 15 minutes the next morning, all of us running on no sleep, and drove straight back to campus. I remember looking at the cabin in the rearview mirror as we pulled out, half expecting to see someone standing on the porch watching us go, and being almost disappointed in some sick way, when there wasn't anyone there, like at least seeing something would have been better than the not knowing. We never found out who it was. The rental company, when Priya called to report what happened and ask for a refund, was apologetic in the vague corporate way that tells you they've had this conversation before and have a script for it. No arrests were ever made, as far as we know. Deputy Pruitt gave us a case number and told us to call if we thought of anything else, and that was the last real contact any of us had with it. The four of us don't really talk about that trip much anymore, not because we fell out of touch, but because there isn't a version of the conversation that doesn't end with all of us a little unsettled for the rest of the day. Ashley moved out to Colorado after graduation and told me once over the phone that she still can't sleep in a room with a window facing a driveway, that she has to have the blinds shut completely no matter what floor she's on. I think about the fourth truck more than I probably should. 3 vehicles passing by on a dead-end road might have been nothing, locals cutting through on some route we didn't know about. Coincidence stacked on coincidence. But the fourth one stopped, and whoever got out of it knew exactly which windows to try, in what order, and knew somehow precisely when to stop knocking and start breaking glass instead. I don't know what would have happened if that deputy had taken 30 minutes instead of 20. I've decided I don't actually want to know. Story 5. Off the grid, I chose the cabin specifically because nobody could find it. That was the whole point. I look back now and think about how stupid that reasoning was. How a place with no address, no cell signal, and no neighbors isn't actually safety. It's just a different kind of exposure, one where nobody's around to hear anything go wrong. My name's Willa Sandberg. I'm 31, I work remote as a copywriter, and in September of 2024, I drove up to a rental cabin outside Randolph, New Hampshire, in the White Mountains, off a dirt spur that comes off Route 2 and climbs into the trees for almost 2 miles before you reach anything. I'd founded it specifically because the listing bragged about having no address you could search for. You got GPS coordinates by email after booking. And at the time, that felt like exactly what I needed. I need to back up and explain why. For about 8 months before that trip, I'd been dealing with an ex-boyfriend named Trent who would not let go of the fact that I'd ended things. It started as excessive texting, moved to showing up at my apartment building unannounced, and by that summer had escalated to him following my car twice, once for almost 20 minutes on the highway, flashing his lights until I got off at an exit just to lose him. I'd filed a police report. I'd gotten a restraining order in July. None of it made me feel meaningfully safer. Orders are pieces of paper, and Trent had never struck me as someone who respected paper. A couple weeks somewhere completely off the radar to decompress after the court hearing. The idea of a cabin nobody could look up felt less like a vacation and more like the only thing keeping me from unraveling. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except my sister Reagan, and I made her promise not to tell anyone else, including our parents, because our mother has a habit of mentioning things to the wrong people without realizing it. I turned my location sharing off on everything, except the one app Reagan and I used between just the two of us. I paid for the cabin in cash through a money order, which the owner, a woman named Carol, who managed the booking over email, seemed used to, given how many of her guests specifically wanted privacy. The first 4 days were exactly what I needed. I worked in the mornings on the cabin's tiny porch, hiked in the afternoons, and for the first time in months, I slept through a full night without waking up convinced I'd heard something at my window. The cabin itself was simple. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a wood stove, solar power that ran a single overhead light and charged my laptop, and the isolation, which I'd worried might feel frightening, instead felt like the first real quiet I'd had in almost a year. That changed on the 5th night. I was in bed around 11 p.m., laptop closed. Half asleep when my phone buzzed. I kept it in airplane mode most of the trip, except for a narrow window each evening where I'd step outside to a spot up the hill where I could get 1 bar of signal, just enough to text Reagan that I was okay. It shouldn't have been able to receive anything inside the cabin, but it buzzed once, and when I picked it up, confused, there was a single text on the screen from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Nice spot." I sat up so fast I knocked my water glass off the nightstand. I stared at that message for what felt like a full minute before I could make myself think straight. No name, no signature, nothing else, and when I tried to reply, the message failed to send. No signal, exactly as expected inside the cabin. I checked the number against Trent's known numbers, the ones I'd saved from the restraining order paperwork. It didn't match any of them. It didn't match anything. I told myself, sitting there in the dark with my heart going too fast, that it had to be some delayed message glitch. A text sent hours earlier from somewhere with signal that had only now pushed through on some fluke of the network catching a stray bar. I've since learned that's not really how it works, that a message either sends or it doesn't. But that night I needed an explanation that let me fall back asleep, and I made myself believe it. I didn't sleep, not really. Around 1 a.m. I heard something outside that I initially told myself was a raccoon or a deer, a rustling near the tree line, moving along the perimeter of the cabin's small clearing. I got up, looked out through a gap in the curtain, and didn't see anything, which somehow didn't make me feel better. The next morning, hiking up the hill to my 1 spot of signal, I called Reagan and told her about the text. She was quiet for a second, then asked me to read her the number, and when I did, she said she didn't recognize it either, but that it was worth reporting anyway, and asked if I wanted to come home. I said no. I look back and can't fully explain that decision, except to say that some part of me had convinced myself leaving would mean admitting Trent, or whoever it was, had won. And I wasn't ready to give him that. I stayed 2 more days without incident, aside from a persistent unease I couldn't fully shake, the kind where you find yourself listening between every sound instead of just hearing it. On the 8th night, everything changed again. I'd gone to bed around midnight, and sometime later, the clock by the bed read 2:13 a.m. when I finally looked, I woke to the sound of the cabin's front door handle turning, slow, deliberate, the same motion you'd use if you were trying not to make noise, but hadn't accounted for how much an old brass handle creaks. I lay frozen, certain I'd locked that door, replaying the memory of doing it that same evening, the specific click of the deadbolt. The handle stopped turning. There was a pause, maybe 30 seconds, and then 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate in a way that felt less like someone trying to get my attention and more like someone confirming I was inside. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I grabbed my phone, which had no signal, and sat with my back against the headboard, staring at the bedroom door for what I can only describe as the longest hour of my life. The knocking didn't come again. But around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps circle the cabin once, slow, unhurried, pause outside my bedroom window specifically. I could hear breathing, or told myself I could, close enough to the glass that it fogged faintly in the cold, a small gray patch I found the next morning and stared at like it might tell me something, and then move away, back toward the tree line, and go quiet. At first light, I found something in the dirt near the front step that I hadn't noticed before. A single cigarette butt, fresh, still faintly smelling of smoke when I picked it up with a tissue, though I'd never seen Trent smoke in the 2 years we dated, which somehow made it worse instead of better. The possibility that this wasn't him at all, but someone else, some stranger who'd simply found me the same way he might have, whoever he was. I left that day. I didn't wait for an afternoon hiking window or a scheduled check-in with Reagan. I packed everything into my car in under 20 minutes and drove straight down the mountain, checking my mirrors more than the road in front of me, and didn't stop until I hit a gas station with full signal almost 40 minutes away, where I sat in the parking lot and cried for a while before I could make myself call the police. The investigation that followed didn't lead anywhere concrete. The unknown number that had texted me turned out to be from a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in Vermont, untraceable to any name. There was no security footage at the store old enough to still exist by the time anyone thought to ask. Trent, when questioned, had an alibi for at least part of that week. He'd been seen at his job in Massachusetts, though the timeline had gaps large enough that the detective handling my case admitted, off the record, that it wasn't airtight. I never found out for certain if it was him. I've turned that ambiguity over so many times it's worn smooth, like a stone you keep in your pocket without meaning to. Sometimes I think it had to be Trent. Who else would know to find me somewhere with no listed address? Other times, worse times, I think about the cigarette butt, about a stranger who happened across an isolated off-grid cabin with a young woman alone inside, and I wonder if the truly frightening version of this story isn't that someone specific tracked me down, but that it didn't need to be someone specific at all. That being alone and unreachable was danger enough on its own, regardless of who found me. I don't rent isolated places anymore. I don't turn my location sharing off, not even for a night. And sometimes, working late at my kitchen table in my apartment now, 3 deadbolts and a downtown Boston street outside instead of trees, I still find myself listening for a door handle turning slow enough to not make noise. And I don't think that particular kind of listening ever fully goes away. Story 6. Every October since I was a kid, my family has used a hunting cabin about 14 miles outside Dubois, Wyoming, up a Forest Service road that turns to washboard gravel and then eventually to not much of a road at all. My grandfather built it in the 60s, mostly by hand, and it's been passed down since. No electricity, a hand pump for water, a propane stove, the kind of place that hasn't changed much in 60 years, except for the newer roof we put on it in 2019. In October of 2025, I took my daughter Sadie up there for her first real hunting trip. She was 15, sharp, a better shot than I was at her age, and I'd been looking forward to that trip for months, just the 2 of us. 5 days, elk season, the kind of thing I hoped she'd remember for the rest of her life. My name's Grant Holloway. I'm 45, I work in construction management down in Riverton, and I want to say up front that I've spent a lot of time in remote places, and I don't scare easy. I need you to understand that going in, because what happened that week has genuinely changed how I think about being alone in the woods, and I don't say that lightly. We drove up on a Sunday, got the cabin opened, stove going, gear unpacked. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. Cold mornings, good sign on the ridges above camp, Sadie handling herself better than plenty of adults I've hunted with. We didn't see another soul, which wasn't unusual for that particular drainage. It's remote enough that most hunters don't bother with it. The first thing that felt wrong happened Tuesday morning. We'd gone out before first light to sit above a meadow where we'd cut fresh elk tracks the day before and came back to camp around 10 to grab lunch. The cabin door, which I distinctly remembered latching, an old external hook latch, nothing fancy, but something I check out of habit every single time, was standing open about 6 inches. Inside, nothing appeared to be missing, but a bag of jerky I'd left on the counter was gone, and in its place, oddly, someone had left the empty wrapper folded neatly into a small square and set exactly where the bag. I told Sadie it was probably a pine marten or a raccoon, animals that can absolutely work a latch if they're motivated enough, and I mostly believed that myself in the moment. Animals don't fold wrappers, though, and some part of me clocked that detail and set it aside without saying anything, the way you do when you don't want to worry your kid over something you can't explain yet. Wednesday, we found a game trail cairn, a small stack of rocks deliberately placed, the kind hunters sometimes use to mark a route, about a quarter-mile from camp, on a spur trail that led toward an old line shack, another structure from decades back, mostly collapsed, that my grandfather used to talk about but that our family hadn't used or maintained in my lifetime.
Hadn't built that cairn?
Sadie hadn't either. It wasn't old. The rocks were dry on top, but the ground beneath them, when I nudged one aside, was still damp, meaning it had been placed recently, likely that same week. I didn't love that. I've hunted that drainage my whole life and never once run across sign of another camp nearby, let alone deliberate trail markers pointing toward an old ruin most maps don't even bother naming anymore. That night, we heard something outside the cabin a little after 9 p.m. Footsteps, unhurried, circling at what sounded like maybe 30 or 40 feet out, far enough that our headlamps didn't reach it when I stepped onto the porch to check. I called out, the way you would if you assumed it was another hunter who'd wandered off course, something like, just checking who's out there, and got no response. The footsteps stopped when I spoke. Then, after a long pause, they started again, moving away, unhurried, toward the direction of that old line. Sadie asked me straight out if I thought someone was messing with us. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know, but that we'd keep the rifle close and not take chances. I want to be honest that I downplayed how unsettled I actually was, because she's my kid, and I didn't want her lying awake scared on what was supposed to be a trip she'd remember fondly. Thursday morning, hunting a different ridge further from camp, we came across something that changed the whole tone of the trip for me. In a stand of lodgepole about 2 miles out, we found a rough camp, not a legal permitted campsite, but a lean-to built from downed branches and a blue tarp gone gray with age, a fire ring with old ash, and laid out on a flat rock nearby like some kind of display, a row of small animal bones, picked clean, arranged in a straight line from largest to smallest. No pack, no gear I could see that suggested a legitimate backcountry, just that lean-to, that fire ring, and that unsettling little row of bones that felt less like trash and more like it had been arranged on purpose for someone to find. We left that area immediately and didn't discuss going back. I marked the coordinates on my GPS, intending to report it to the Forest Service once we had signal again, which wasn't happening at camp. We were relying on a satellite messenger for genuine emergencies only, and this didn't feel, at that point, like it crossed that line. I know now that decision was wrong. I've replayed it more times than I can count. Thursday night is the one I still have trouble talking about in full detail. Even now. We'd eaten dinner, banked the stove, and gone to bed early. Both of us in the 2 bunks along the cabin's back wall, rifle within reach the way I'd taken to keeping it since Wednesday. Around 11 p.m., I woke to the sound of the cabin door handle being tested. Not violently, just a slow, patient pressure against the hook latch from outside. The same kind of testing you'd do if you already knew there was a latch and were checking whether it would hold. I sat up fast enough to wake Sadie, put a hand on her shoulder to keep her still and quiet, and grabbed the rifle. The pressure on the door stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. No footsteps, no wind, nothing but our own breathing and the tick of the cooling stove. And then, close to the single front window, a face appeared for just a second, backlit by nothing, gone almost as fast as it registered. I want to describe it honestly. I didn't get a clean look. Bearded, gaunt, eyes that caught what little light there was in a way that stayed with me since. And then it was gone from the glass entirely, and I heard footsteps moving fast away from the cabin. Not the slow, deliberate pace from before, but something closer to a run. Sadie was awake, gripping my arm, and to her enormous credit she didn't scream, didn't panic loud enough to give away exactly where we were in the room. We sat like that, rifle across my knees, Until first light, neither of us saying much beyond checking in every so often that the other one was okay. At dawn, we packed everything we could carry and hiked straight out to the truck instead of finishing the trip, 4 miles down that gravel road faster than I've ever covered it, both of us checking behind us more than in front. We drove to Dubois, and I called the sheriff's office and the Forest Service both, gave them the coordinates of the lean-to camp, and described what we'd seen at the window. A deputy told me a few days later, when I followed up, that a search of the area had turned up the abandoned lean-to camp matching my description, but no person, and no further sign in the days since. He mentioned, somewhat reluctantly when I pushed for more, that there had been sporadic reports over the years of an unidentified man living rough in that general district, sometimes described by hunters as aggressive or unsettling but never violent enough, or documented enough to warrant a sustained search and remove effort. No name, no confirmed identity, just a pattern of stories going back further than the deputy seemed entirely comfortable admitting, about someone out there who didn't want to be found and occasionally made that clear to people who got too close. We haven't been back to that cabin since, though my brothers still use it most years without incident, or at least none they've told me about. I think about that line shack sometimes, the one Grandpa used to mention, the one that Cairn had pointed toward, and I wonder what's actually still standing out there, half collapsed, 4 decades since anyone in my family set foot near it, and who exactly has been using it since. Sadie doesn't talk about that trip much. She still hunts, still shoots better than I do most days, but she won't sleep in a room with a window that doesn't have a curtain, not since. I don't push her on it. Some things you don't need explained twice. I keep the coordinates of that lean-to camp saved on my phone, for no reason I can fully justify. I've never gone back to check if it's still there. Some part of me needs to believe it's just an old camp, abandoned. Nothing more than a strange coincidence of timing and a startled trespasser who ran the second he was seen. Another part of me thinks about that row of small bones arranged largest to smallest on a flat rock. And I don't think that's the kind of thing a person does once, on a whim, in an empty stretch of woods with no one around to see it. I think that's the kind of thing someone does because they've done it before, and because they'll do it again, long after my family and I stop being the ones sleeping 14 miles up that road. If you made it this far, you know these 6 weren't picked at random. A caretaker who watches too closely, a neighbor who won't say what he means, a shape at the edge of a trail camera, a truck that keeps coming back, a stalker who somehow always knows the address, a camp in the trees that isn't supposed to be there. Different people, different mountains, different years, but the same quiet thing underneath all of them. Isolation doesn't protect you. Sometimes it's the reason you were found in the first place. If one of these got under your skin, let me know which one down in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe out there, and maybe check that lock twice tonight.